the armies of Europe set forth. The coming of the war was greeted with enormous enthusiasm in the capitals of Europe for each nation. A cause was at hand in St. Petersburg. A huge crowd congregated with flags, banners, icons, and portraits of Tsar Nicholas. The Emperor Nicholas responded to the chants of his people by making a public appearance on his balcony. In Paris, a French officer leaving with his regiment for Verdun wrote, "A great nation's heart was beating tumultuously, as in days long past. Crowds were gathered at every station, behind every barrier, and at every window along our road. Cries of Vive la France and Vive l'armée. It could be heard everywhere while people waved handkerchiefs and hats. The women were throwing kisses and heaped flowers on a convoy. At one grade crossing, a young woman lifted her baby towards us, shouting, 'He too, like you, will go someday and do his duty.'" In 1792, the soul of France had again attained the height of her greatest period in history. In Berlin, the Kaiser appeared before the Reichstag, dressed in a field-gray army uniform to address the tumultuous crowd. "I have no knowledge any longer of party or creed. I know only Germans, and in token thereof, I ask all of you to give me your hand." He received thunderous applause and unprecedented support from the people of Germany. Saturday, August 1st in London was a quiet day for the officer at the city's main recruiting office. Only 8 recruits presented themselves to volunteer for duty. Several days passed by, however, and when the officer returned from his days off, the crowds waiting for him were so dense that it took him 20 minutes and the help of 20 policemen to get through to his desk. From that minute he worked through the day, testing and sweating in the recruits. When Lord Kitchener's first appeal went out for 100,000 new recruits, what followed was 100 men an hour, 3,000 a day. 6,000 over the war's first weekend joined the army. So many came now that many had to be turned away. In Munich, a crowd gathered in the Odeonplatz to celebrate the declaration of war. In the center of this crowd stood a failed Austrian artist named Adolf Hitler. After leaving the plaza, he had once petitioned the King of Bavaria to be allowed to volunteer for the Bavarian army. Meanwhile, in Paris, there was no French monarch to incite the citizens. It was the departure of the city's regiments to the railroad stations which brought forth the crowds. The line of trains leaving starting areas throughout Europe was unending. The railway section of the German Great General Staff timetable accounted for the movement of 11,000 trains in this mobilization period. But feet and hooves were as important as trains in 1914, as cavalry and infantry were deployed onto the line of march, following intense training at the camps. An infantry division on the march filled 14 miles of road, and the endurance of horses, along with that of the infantry, was pushed to the limit in the race to drive the advance forward. Before Paris, there was the Urge in the north and the other fortresses of the Belgian rivers, which impeded any easy crossing for the German army into France. Austria may have lit the fuse, but Germany started the fire. At 5 a.m. on August 4th, German cavalry crossed the border into Belgium. The invasion of Belgium was demanded by their Schlieffen Plan, a contingency plan wherein if war were to break out, Germany would attack France first and then Russia, thus the invasion of Belgium would give the Germans a tactical advantage. Schlieffen estimated that should Germany have to face both France and Russia, the latter would be slower to mobilize and deploy, giving Germany a vital margin of 6 weeks in which to overpower France by means of a massive and rapid campaign. In the event that France is defeated, Germany could then transfer the bulk of her forces to the east to meet the Russian steamroller. There was a loose end to this master plan, however. The fortresses along France's northeastern frontier would have the capacity to fatally delay the German army's advancement, maybe even halting it entirely. Accordingly, Schlieffen resolved that German forces must sweep through Belgium, trampling neutrality before driving into northwestern France. The pivotal role was given to 5 armies deployed between Metz and Holland. The most powerful forces were allocated to the extreme right wing of the offensive. One army here was expected to swing round to the west of Paris, on the outer flank of a colossal wheeling movement, which was intended to take on the opposing French armies in the rear before trapping them against their own frontier. The whole operation was expected to be over in 40 days. Changes made to the Schlieffen Plan by Moltke, however, dictated that the German right-wing armies must pass through the Meuse Gap between Holland and the Den, a narrow corridor dominated by Liège. Failure to capture Liège and its ring of 12 forts quickly would wreck the complex German timetable at the start of the campaign. The strength of the Belgian forts had alarmed Schlieffen. His battalion were immensely strong, subterranean and self-contained, surrounded by a ditch 30 feet deep. Their thick skins would have to be broken by aimed artillery fire, and quickly, for a delay at the Meuse crossings, would throw into jeopardy the smooth evolution of the Schlieffen Plan. No gun heavy enough for the work existed at the time of Schlieffen's retirement in 1906. By 1909, however, Krupp had produced a prototype of a 420mm howitzer. The Austrian Skoda company was meanwhile working on a 305mm model, and it had the advantage of being road transportable. The group howitzer in its original form had to be transported by rail and embedded for action at the end of a specially built spur track. Such was the urgency that the German war plan provided for the detachment of a special task force from 2nd Army to complete the mission, commanded by General Otto von Image. Its top line was drawn between Aachen and Open at the north of the narrow corridor of French territory lying between Holland and Luxembourg. The time allotted for the mission was 48 hours. It was expected by the Germans that Belgium would either not resist an invasion of its territory, or should it do so, that its resistance would be easily extinguished. Both expectations proved wrong. One of the clauses of the oath sworn by the Belgian sovereign on the accession to the throne charged him with defense of the national territory. Albert I, King of the Belgians, was a man to take his responsibilities to heart. The German ultimatum was delivered on the evening of Sunday, August 2nd. Belgium would not appeal for French and British assistance until her territory was physically violated. The Belgian replied that the German ultimatum was delivered at 7 a.m. on the morning of August 3rd. Later that evening, the Kaiser sent a personal appeal to Albert, restating his friendliest intentions and claiming the compulsion of the arm as justification for the invasion is about to begin. On its receipt, the Belgian king reacted with fury and with outrage. He immediately gave orders for the destruction of the bridges and the tunnels at the Luxembourg border. The Belgian army was weak but willing to fight behind its superb forts and its hastily constructed fences. The king also charged the commander of the Liège fortress to hold on to the end. Lamar was a man of honor, and despite his advanced age, held courage. He was the first true hero of the Great War, and his courage was to be tested as he faced the most powerful military force in the world. The Meuse, which he was entrusted to hold, is a mighty river. At Liège, the river runs in a narrow gorge 450 feet deep, virtually impenetrable by normal means. His command entered Belgium early on the morning of August 4, when they came under fire from Belgian cavalrymen and Cyprus troops. Pressing on to Liège, the Germans found the bridges above and below the city blown to smithereens. The German bombardment on the eastern forts opened shortly afterwards. When the infantry and cavalry attempted to advance, they were stopped dead in their tracks. The garrisons manning the forts returned a steady fire, while the interval troops manning the hastily dug entrenchments fought valiantly whenever the German advance guards tried to penetrate the line. Throughout the night of August 5th, German casualties mounted steadily. Early in the morning of August 6th, General Erich Ludendorff rode forward into the confusion to find that the commander of the 14th Brigade had been killed. Instantly assuming the vacancy, Ludendorff fought his new command to a high point from which he could look down on Liège itself. Large in physique and personality, he resolved on the morning of August 7th to launch the 14th Brigade into the center of Liège. The surrender of the garrison gave him possession of the city. He decided to return post-haste to Aachen and urged for Second Army to complete his success. The lay prone some 300 yards away, but the gun was fired electrically. 60 seconds ticked by, the time needed for the shell to traverse its 4,000-meter trajectory. Everyone listened in from the telephone report of a battery commander. The first of the shells was set with a delay fuse and ripped through the protective skin of the fort. The 8th struck home. The next morning, they were joined by others which had just completed the journey from Essen. By 12:30, Fort Pontis was a wreck and had surrendered. Fire then shifted to Fort Amboy, which surrendered at 5:30. On and on they advanced and bombarded. Finally, on the 15th of August, after 140 minutes of bombardment, concrete was turned to rubble and human flesh to a bloody pulp. Amid the ruins, the general was found lying insensible. Erich sat from the stretcher on which his captors placed him and asked the general to bear witness that he found him unconscious. August 16th saw the falling of 2 more fortresses, and with these 2 victories, the end of a 300-year-old military trust in the power of fortresses spelled certain doom for the country. Liège had fallen, but far to the south, the French army was on the move. The French had a plan of their own, simple and to the point. Whatever the circumstances, it is the commander-in-chief's intention to advance. All the forces united to the attack of the German army. Whatever the circumstance, the French army would advance. Whatever the circumstance, in full strength. Whatever the circumstances, through the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine under the Rhine. Whatever the circumstance, the pride of France would not falter. The French infantry would march, still dressed in the red uniforms of 50 years before. Amid the uniforms of old France was a touch of Africa. Allies from Algeria and Morocco, and the famous Foreign Legion. The cavalry would advance, still wearing uniforms worn at the Battle of Waterloo, but eager to charge and smash the German enemy. With uniforms drawn from history, and ideas drawn from fiction, the army was more poised than ever to stand firm. And they were up to date in one respect. They had the finest field gun in the world, the 75mm. Flexible and mobile, it was capable of firing 25 rounds per minute, and the French army had them in great numbers. Europe's two greatest powers were set to collide. The French Warplan 17 was first put to the test on August 6th, when General Brunon's 7th Corps advanced into the Green Mountains of Upper Alsace. The French army was able to retake Mauthausen. Bruno was soon obliged by German troops from Strasbourg to retire in disorder, and Mulhausen was once again Mulhausen.
We actually had to run after them. At first we found heaps of French army blankets, which the soldiers had thrown away. Then we found French greatcoats. Then we found French knapsacks. Then we found French belts with ammunition pouches full of cartridges.
On August 14th, Joffre ordered the army of Alsace to try again. Once again, Mulhausen then became a French city and in a matter of hours reverted back to its German. As threats to the Allied left and center developed, Joffre had to withdraw formations for use elsewhere along the front. Mulhausen would remain in German hands for the foreseeable future. These opening moves left the French with only a small corner of Alsace in the eastern foothills of the Vosges. The principal thrust into Lorraine by Dubé's First Army into the Second Army also began on the 14th of August. The French advanced as liberators, not conquerors. The man in charge of the Kaiser's vast army was a man of unsteady nerves. General Ludwig von Merkur was a cultured, thoughtful, reasonable man, but he was also a twisted, uncertain man. Now, as the French were about to advance once again into Alsace and to launch a grand all-out offensive into Lorraine, Merkur's decisions grew upon him. The ambitions of other generals also came into effect. When Crown Prince Rupert of Bavaria proposed a counterattack by his 6th and 7th Army, Merkur, seduced by the prospect of enveloping both French flanks, let them proceed. The subsequent actions on August 29th rapidly revealed that for the French infantry, courageous spirit would not, by itself, triumph over the cold, modern artillery and machine guns. Having vastly underestimated the extent to which the Germans would use reservists, and still unaware of the real width of the German drive through Belgium, Joffre misjudged the strength of the German center. If the French plan seemed to be thrown into a disarray, Merkur's overall handling of German operations was even less certain than that of the French. On August 17, he had made a misguided effort to improve the coordination of the German right wing, placing Krupp under the orders of the more cautious Bülow. By the 19th, the true scale of German strength and movement began to dawn upon La Rosa, the French Fifth Army commander. As he approached the battlefield, he found the German Second and Third Armies advancing towards him from the north and east through Belgium. La Rosa felt he must act immediately to avert disaster. By the time La Rosa realized the danger, the British Expeditionary Force under Field Marshal Sir John French had reached a rendezvous area with the Allied left. For once in British history, the army was taking to the field with great efficiency. 1,800 special trains carried them to their ports of embarkation, where one day alone, 80 trains ran into Southampton docks. An average of 50,000 tons of shipping per day, safe and unhindered under the protection of the Royal Navy. carried the expeditionary force to France. Landings in France began in deep secrecy on August 7th. Field Marshal Lord Kitchener, who had been appointed Secretary of State for War on August 5th, feared that the forward concentration of his army might lead to the BEF being overwhelmed by the German forces massing north of the Meuse. He could not change the assembly area, but the perceived threat of a German invasion caused him to delay the deployment of 2 regular divisions. Thus, at the start of the campaign, volatile Sir John French only had 4 divisions and 1 cavalry division on hand. His problems and his notoriously vile temper worsened when the commander of 2nd Corps, Grierson, suffered a fatal heart attack, forcing Kitchener to replace him with General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, whose relations with the French had long been tense. After an otherwise smooth assembly, the BLF moved up into the industrial region on August 22nd. It was there that they expected to participate in an Allied offensive into Belgium. Instead, it rapidly became evident that the BEF was directly in the path of the German First Army. 750,000 men sweeping down from the northeast, moving swiftly and mercilessly. Each day, the Royal Flying Corps would fly its recon. Some flights would find nothing, but one scouting over the old battlefield of Waterloo was more fortunate.
We found the whole area completely covered with hordes of field grey uniforms and heavy stuff, transport, guns, and what have you, coming towards us. In fact, it looked as though the place was alive with the Germans.
Returning to base, the pilot was rushed off to Sir John French to tell him what he'd seen.
I showed him a map all marked out. He said, "Have you been over that area?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And I explained what I'd seen, and they were enormously interested, and then they began reading the figures that I'd estimated, whereupon I seemed to feel that their interest faded. They seemed to look at each other and shrug their shoulders. And then French turned round to me and said, "Now, yes, my boy, this is terribly interesting, but tell me all about an airplane. What can you do when you're in these machines? Aren't they very dangerous? Are they very cold? Can you see anything? What do you do if your engine stops?" and all that sort of stuff. And I couldn't bring him back to Earth because obviously he wasn't interested. And then I again tried, and he looked at me and he said, "Yes, this is very interesting what you've got, but you know, our information, which of course is correct, proves that you really, I don't think you could really have seen as much as you think. Well, of course, I quite understand, you may imagine you have, but it's not the case."
There would be no ground offensive. The British Army was digging in. 2nd Corps manned the line on the canal and a small salient around the town, while Lieutenant General Sir Douglas Haig's 1st Corps was to its right. For a time, Crook was ignorant of the British deployment across his axis of advance. During the misty morning of Sunday, August 23rd, Crook's leading corps ran headlong into the BEF position.
Quite suddenly, out of the blue, we saw cavalry coming towards us. They'd come out of the right, on our right flank. I said, "Good gracious, it's Germans." So we immediately started to fire. We fired fuse north, and they got about 300 yards, I suppose, from the gun.
By 9 a.m., both sides were fighting tooth and nail. the Germans made a succession of piecemeal, badly coordinated assaults against Smith-Dorrien's position in the salient and along the canal. The British quickly became acquainted with the power and accuracy of German artillery. In the trenches, they laid in wait, but what they didn't expect was the smashing blow that struck them in one fell swoop. The sky began to rain bullets and shells. Many a good comrade fell. Then German infantry came forward in solid square blocks, surging towards the canal and its crossings. The BEF's incomparable musketry roared to life, exacting a terrible toll from the dense German formations. They were in solid square blocks, standing out sharply against the skyline. The Allies could do nothing except hide within the trenches without sight or sound. But at an opportune moment, the officers gave the word, and a counterattack was issued, sending the Germans running scattered like drunk men hit between the eyes. The Allies pushed forward with a willpower that could topple mountains, advancing in companies of quite 150 men in files 5 deep. The first company was simply blasted away to heaven by a volley at 700 yards, and in their insane formation, every bullet was almost sure to make its mark. The Allies had absolutely no chance. This was a mad minute. 15 rounds of aimed rifle fire that the British infantry alone was trained to do. It did the trick. The Germans were shot flat. However, they soon bounced back, and before long, German pressure began to build once again. The French Fifth Army was falling back, exposing the British flanks. Although Haig's first call was not heavily pressed, Smith-Dorrien's troops largely held on until late in the afternoon, when relentless German pressure and numerical superiority finally began to weigh down the hearts of the British troops. Orders were issued to fall back. Retreat for more had begun. Accordingly, First Corps fell back about 2 miles to pre-selected positions. The BEF had performed well in its first important battle, keeping Crook's First Army at bay for the best part of the day. Most of the 1,600 British casualties were in Second Corps. On came the Germans. The Schlieffen Plan was still on time and target. That night, the threat to the French Fifth Army's right prompted the commander to withdraw without consulting Joffre or the British. The BEF had no alternative but to conform with long-range arc. The whole Allied line was in retreat, and thousands of frightened homeless people joined the armies on the roads west. Joffre made a decision that changed history. Refusing to abandon all thoughts of an offensive, he created a new Sixth Army on the endangered Allied left. He did this by coolly taking troops from his own reserves and the French right for this very purpose. On August 26th, Joffre went to his second meeting with Sir John French. The scene was witnessed by a young liaison officer, Lieutenant Spears.
Joffre began to explain the purport of an order, extremely important, issued. Whilst he was doing so, in walked Lansac, bustling in. Then Joffre went on explaining this order of his, when Sir John French said, "What about this order?" "I haven't seen the order." Whereupon General Wilson, the Sub-Chief of Staff, explained to Galba,
awkwardly, I thought, that some order had been received during the night, but it hadn't been dealt with yet. I got the impression it had been translated. When General Joffre realized that his orders hadn't even been received and read by the British, he seemed overwhelmed with discouragement. It was the only time I've ever known that he seemed to lose heart himself, to be completely deflated.
This was an abject moment for General Joffre. When he left British headquarters in the early afternoon, he carried away with a serious impression of the fragility about extreme left. That is exactly what Smith-Dorrien's British forces were about to do. Joffre's calmness and rational approach under pressure was in total contrast to the increasing nervousness of his opponent. The German chief of the General Staff was allowing fleeting operational opportunities to obscure the original strategic aim. The dazzling prospect of achieving a double envelopment of the Allied armies had already persuaded him to give the commanders of the left-wing armies their head. On August 23rd, he further dismantled the Schlieffen Plan by releasing 2 corps from the key right wing to help block the Russian advance in East Prussia. Given that formations had also been detached to deal with various fortresses, the 3 German right-wing armies had by now lost more than a quarter of their strength and were still yet to fulfill their principal task. For the Allied and German troops, who had to march some 20 miles a day in the searing late August heat, thirst, fatigue, hunger, and blistered feet would have much greater concern than the grand designs of their commanders. On August 26th, the anniversary of the legendary English victory of the Battle of Crécy, Smith-Dorrien judged that the Germans were so close to 2 corps that he could not disengage without fighting another battle. Contrary to the wishes of Sir John French, he conducted a determined holding action. But the Germans again suffered severely in the face of the burst-concentrated rifle fire. Cavalry and horse artillery struck against the opposing forces. The infantry was under pressure on the forefront of enemy lines, yet the British held on strong once again.
We'd hardly got our head covered before the ridge, about 3/4 of a mile away, was literally swarming with Germans in their field grey uniforms. And they advanced, and we received the order to rapid fire. It was probably 3/4 of a mile away, an extreme range for a rifle, but we rapid fired at 15 rounds a minute at these advancing Germans, and they broke up into smaller groups of probably 6 or 8, advancing through a cornfield where the corn was in stooks. As we rapid fired, they took cover behind these stooks of corn.
The English infantry stiffened once again. The morning hours passed slowly as more and more Germans entered the fight. The vast British reserves were thrown in to meet this new danger.
We were in reserve. The brigade was formed up, and orders came that we were required on the left of the line. We go fast. And we marched 4 miles over the left of the line, came to a village whose name I don't really remember, and found Smith-Dorrien standing outside his headquarters. And he waved to us as we passed and said, "I think we're holding them all right. It won't be wanted here. And everything's going fine."
The exposed artillery batteries on the right flank lost heavily that morning. Men on the battle line, weary, suffering from the heat, began to drift away from the battle. It was time to go, if humanly possible. It was time to go, if humanly possible. The biggest problem was to remove the guns. The limbers and the crews were smashed to pieces on the hillside. Dead horses and dead men as far as the eye can see. The teams that were left dashed forward through jeering infantry. As they came within view of the enemy, they were struck by a hurricane of shrapnel and bullets from machine guns, but still they went on. The officer in charge of the teams was killed. One team shot down in a heap before the position was reached, but 2 guns of the 122nd Battery were carried out without mishap. A third was limbered up, but the horses went down instantly. The rest had to be left to the Germans. Incredibly, the 3 divisions of Smith-Dorrien Corps slipped away, and the Germans had no idea where they had gone. It was the British Army's first real battle, and the cost was considerable. 2 corps lost 7,182 officers and men, and 38 guns. Now they were retreating again, tired and dirty, but because of their timely stand, they were able to continue their retreat in relatively good order.
We marched and marched. Day after day, we got very little food. I'd eaten my emergency rations at Bleecker 2, which of course I shouldn't have done. We had a tin of bully beef. I'd eaten that as well. And we were all very, very hungry. We certainly did get a cup of tea occasionally, or a canteen of tea. And we marched through a forest, which was very cold and dank. We were marching during the daytime, very big forest. It was very cold in this forest.
Through the heart of the day, they marched 30 miles to the south.
I've seen infantry there with their feet bleeding. I've seen infantry with their boots off and putties wrapped round them. I've seen men sobbing and turning round asking our officers, why the hell can't we fight? Why won't you let us fight?
It was a hopeless sight. Footsore soldiers and terrified civilians, and a single mass of humanity. And that hopelessness began to reach Allied Commander Joffre.
It was a very, very strange thing to see a single man exercising his will over masses of like 1 million men, with the fate of his country in balance, having to satisfy the political requirements of his own government, the British government, having to face a catastrophic situation and never getting rattled.
Smith-Dorrien's strained relations with Sir John French deteriorated beyond repair. Yet the Standby 2 Corps achieved its objective, for it not only led the Germans to overestimate British strength, but also deterred Crook from immediate pursuit. Moreover, the initial mistaken conclusion that the BEF was falling back southwest rather than to the south gave the British formations an unexpected breathing space, permitting them to retreat comparatively unscathed over the next few days. This respite did not dispel Sir John's gloom, however. Feeling let down by the French and disheartened by the BEF's casualties, he now believed that he could only save the expeditionary force by taking it out of the Allied line. It took the personal intervention of Kitchener in a hastily arranged visit to France on September 1st to prevent Sir John from following this course. But even with Kitchener's intervention and Draft's cool demeanor, it still seemed that the only thing that could save the Allies in the West was a miracle.